Welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by the fantastic Steve Kenzie. Now, Steve is the Executive Director for the UN Global Compact Network in the UK. He is an exceptionally committed advocate for business for good and in specific sustainable development with a broad knowledge of corporate responsibility themes, including environment, human rights, anti-corruption and inclusive business. He's achieved this through a very varied international career within the private sector and civil society. He's also a very entrepreneurial individual, fantastic communication skills, and a very interesting background, having been actually born in Niagara Falls in Canada and now being based in London. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks, Leila. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining me. And Steve, I wonder for our listeners who perhaps don't know you personally, as I obviously have the privilege to do so, whether you could give us a synopsis of how you came to be where you are today. And, you know, of course, in a very well-known organization, the UN, spearheading the Global Compact Network in the UK.
Well, it has been a circuitous journey. So as you say, I was born in Canada, in Niagara Falls, in central Canada, and grew up there, and then moved to British Columbia, and I did an undergrad degree in marketing at the University of British Columbia. A lovely few years there, and graduated though into a recession that was hitting the West Coast particularly hard. So with a group of friends, we moved to Toronto. And I think it's always a bit of a grass is always greener scenario. And I look now at the friends that stayed in Vancouver and weathered that early storm and how lucky they are now to be living in such a great place. But obviously very happy to be here. I worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, Canada's largest retailer at the time. After a couple of years though, got a bit of wanderlust and I quit. And jumped on my bicycle and started riding, and I toured around Europe and other countries. Really, it stretched for a few years of sort of nomadic, working at odd jobs. But then I got an idea for a business in my travels, and Cheapskates Quality Sporting Goods was born, and I started that with just a couple of $1,000s. In a city called North Bay in Northern Ontario, and never imagined it was going to be really much of anything. And I thought if it was successful, I would sell it and go traveling again. And if it was unsuccessful, oh well, I hadn't lost much. It hadn't even occurred to me that it would be somewhere in the middle. And so I spent 10 years doing that. And it was sort of a social enterprise. And I really tried to provide employment opportunities for young people and influence the community towards providing more public recreation and more sustainable transport in the form of bicycles and rollerblades and so on. But then it was, my wife got some wanderlust and had decided we'd lived in this small Northern Ontario city for too long, and she announced effectively that we would be moving to the UK. And we started out in Winchester for a year, and the time away from the business allowed me to reflect what would I rather be doing. We just at that point had a 2-year-old daughter, and it had a big impact on my time horizons, I suppose. I'd never really looked much beyond a couple of years, and suddenly I was thinking more in terms of generations and what was the world going to be like for her to grow up in and for her kids. And I just felt like, much as I felt what I was doing was worthwhile, getting people on bikes and so on, I wanted to have more impact than that. And so I went back to school. I went to Imperial College. They have a fantastic MSc program in, it's called environmental technology, but it's really all things environmental. And that was a springboard into a new career. I landed at the International Business Leaders Forum, which was, I think, quite an influential early NGO in that sort of responsible business space. And it was sort of spun out of business in the community with a more international, global orientation, and was really, I would say at the time, through the 90s and the noughties, a peer to the WBCSD, so quite a significant organization. And I worked on a range of projects at IBLF, and just really fortunately for me, I suppose, one of my colleagues who looked after the Global Compact network, which was very small at the time, but she got pregnant, and it was sort of dumped onto me to cover the maternity leave. And it was 20 members at the time, if that, and a couple of days a month of work. Just did it along with everything else, but it grew while the other stuff sort of stayed about the same. And when IBLF wound up in 2013, we were at a point where the Global Compact Network could become independent, and so I've been looking after it full time since.
Wow.
Here we are.
That is a fantastic story. And again, you're able to utilize your entrepreneurial flair to essentially grow something very almost embryonic with 20 members to where it is now, which is, and I know you're speaking on kind of lots of global stages and ultimately liaising with leading global organizations on how they can implement the goals. But what's really nice about the story that you share, not only is it fantastic to learn about people's kind of personal background, but it almost seems serendipity. You know, the way you describe everything, it's almost everything seems to have almost happened for a reason, when, you know, clearly at your core, many years ago, you've always been interested in sustainability, in business, and you know, having that backbone for good, which I think is just absolutely fantastic. And I do love seeing that clearly trends, if that's the right word to use, and businesses are starting to gravitate far more to business for good and business for the sustainable future and our future generations. But you were doing it many years ago, and so it's you know, it's really great to actually hear how it's been embedded across the entire journey for you. And clearly you must have seen a lot change in those years.
Well, this, even when I had my small retail project, it was a source of tremendous frustration the way business was stereotyped, and often by business itself, but falling into these really tired caricatures that business only cared about less taxes, less regulation. And I was a business person who cared about the community in which I was living and raising my family. And so I didn't want other businesses to be able to run completely rampant. I wanted to be working within a framework where everybody took some responsibility for the community where they operated. And I felt it in my heart that this had to be the way, and I was absolutely convinced you could run a successful business this way. And so when I came to my big career transition, that's really what guided it, was a desire, certainly from the MSc, to get a theoretical backing and an empirical support for this idea I had that business could be responsible and profitable at the same time. And I'm, you know, really fortunate that I've been able to find a career where I'm working with companies that also believe that, and where I can proselytize a little bit about that belief that it is possible. And in fact, it is the only way that a business can survive in the long term, is by aligning its interests with those of wider society. It just seems, you know, obvious to me that this is how it must be.
I could not agree more, Steve, and it is music to my ears hearing you speak about the fact that two can coexist in a very happy medium with doing good and also being profitable. And I think, perhaps this is a historical piece, and, perhaps it is a historical piece that I think, previously, if we go back, a decade or so or whatever, where, business and the association with purely being profitable or being almost charity and doing good, you're in one of two camps. Now, those two forces are combined. They're simply, I don't think there's anything dirty at all about talking about the fact that business needs to be profitable. It is how the world exists, making money and things like this. But it does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that it can't be doing very good for wider society, creating jobs, being fruitful. And like you say, I fundamentally believe that it is the only way. Yes, I'm sure there's lots of businesses at the moment that exist, and perhaps inclusivity and perhaps business for good may not be at the forefront, but ultimately, for these organizations to survive in the longer term and generations to come, there must be a business for good angle. And I really think, when you look at kind of, and I know you've, with the UN and GC, lots of connections in with, youngsters, even hear of, Greta Thunberg and these youngsters that are changing the face of the world right now, is that the younger generations, millennials, the zillennials, kids and their kids, they certainly just won't stand for it. They are being born into a world where, thankfully, this is at the forefront now. And businesses must harness it.
It's actually built into the Sustainable Development Goals that we educate everyone about what it means to be sustainable. And I think that's happening, and you can't unlearn it. I think once people are seeing the state of the world and what it's going to take to have a future for these young people, they get it right away, and they're not going to tolerate going forward spending their money in companies that are undermining that agenda, and they're certainly not going to go work for those companies. And so I think that's the most natural sort of Darwinian solution is going to be through employment, where the best and the brightest can choose to work where they want to, because there'll be so much demand for those people, and they will make such an impact on the viability of a business going forward that any company that's not making itself attractive to the best and the brightest as an employer, they're just shooting themselves in the foot. That they have to address this. They have to have that purpose that engages young people. Making rich people richer is not a suitable purpose to attract the best employees to make a business thrive. It might work in the short term, but certainly not in the long term.
I love the descriptor that you use there. It absolutely is almost Darwinian in terms of theories and the evolution that business and humanity and ethos is starting to, is going on right now. And I think more so now than ever before, especially with, of course, the unprecedented times that we are living through. There is a need for that humanity and that personal contact and that empathetic nature of businesses ultimately. And I mean, what's again I find fascinating is the concept that business of the past, and I suppose to a degree business right now, is very much about intelligence, whereas you look at business of the future, what with data analytics, the very fast-paced growth of technology and AI, well, one thing that can't be replicated in its entirety is humanity and that real personal nature and personal touch. And so arguably the future of leadership, the future of businesses and organizations will and should be about the heart.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And Steve, I know that you, of course, with your many members and working with lots of global organizations and of course with a lot of D&I experts, I know that you've moderated many different panels and worked with many different individuals. And I believe you'd mentioned to me previously how adamant these individuals and businesses are, who clearly are passionate about business good because they've joined the network, which is excellent. They are very, very certain, as I am myself as a practitioner, about D&I being something we must be proactive about, and certainly inclusivity at this point in time certainly should not be going on the back burner. I wonder whether you could talk a little to myself and to our listeners a bit about some of the some of the things that you've heard and some of the things that you're kind of hearing through that network and through those HR and other C-suite individuals who are wanting to drive this forward within their businesses.
We have a D&I working group in the network where we have a group of about 20 leaders that in the space that come together to talk through various issues on a quarterly basis. And it's really been numerous times where there's just been revelations for me. And certainly one, was around just unconscious bias and how it's recognized as a real problem that needs to be addressed. But they were all saying how unconscious bias training didn't work. And in fact, it was shocking. They found that when they apparently there was a study done at attempts at shaking this unconscious bias, just actually by telling people that everybody thinks this way, almost made them feel like it was justified, and it actually served to reinforce the biases. And so last year we had a big SDG conference, and I moderated a panel that spoke about D&I issues. And the thing that really stuck with me from that was the need to be proactive about it. And I think this is something that where that unconscious bias becomes so difficult. It leads to a degree of passivity. We all think we hire the best person for the job. Nobody recognizes that this bias has snuck in. And so it's just that there needs to be a conscious effort to avoid it. So we use a hiring platform. It just occurred to me that while we've got this lockdown hiring freeze on, I should be looking for an extension in my membership. But anyways, it's blind. So applicants answer a bunch of questions in an online form that are designed to test their ability to do the job. We don't see their name, their gender. We don't know anything about them, what school they went to, until after we've interviewed them. And it has already kicked up some really interesting results for us. We hired someone into a fairly senior role that doesn't have a master's degree. I think it's safe to say if we were looking at CVs, that person would have probably not got past the first screening, because that would have been an obvious thing that we would have screened for. And it's clear, both from her performance in our application process and her performance in the job, his or her, that apparently a master's degree is not a requirement for the job as it was. And I think this is true of so many things where we throw up these qualifications that actually don't speak to the specific actual skills that we're looking for. And it's the same around what school someone went to. The fact that they went to a Russell Group school oftentimes will have no bearing. And in fact, it could even work against one. And it's simply a pointless assumption and a bias that we allow to sneak in. And so how do we avoid it? And so we've got this program, and I think it's working pretty well, but of course we still need to get the right applicants. And this is where we're starting to see that we're not seeing the diversity in our applicants that we want. So we have a great program that's blind, but we can only work with the pool of people that we've been given. And of course, this is just another layer that we need to be proactively looking at. In my narrow, middle-aged white man worldview, I'm thinking, well, we advertise it on LinkedIn. What more can you do? And clearly, it's not enough. We need to be conscious and proactive if we're going to achieve this. And final point on this is just, it's clear diversity and inclusion are good for business. So just like any other undertaking that I would engage in installing a new CRM, looking for cost savings elsewhere, you do it proactively and consciously, and you work to bring about this change that has been identified as being good for the business. Why would we do anything different here? It needs to be taken on strategically and with structure and with purpose and proaction.
It is so insightful and so interesting what you've just said there, and there's a couple of comments I want to make, if I may. First of all, it pleases me so much to hear that you've been doing blind interviewing. You know, with my, cause I have my, exec search business, which to be fair goes a lot under the radar, but you know, talent is just such a fascinating subject to me because that's, that's my background. But it's brilliant, first and foremost, to hear that you are blind interviewing and to see the results, that you've actually implemented it and put it into practice. And clearly you've got someone who is very, very capable and would not have perhaps been considered. Is absolutely one way to start actually leveling that playing field and to give ultimately equal opportunities, which of course is everything that the goals are about. Interesting that some of the feedback was that unconscious bias training doesn't work, and I would agree with that to a certain extent, because I do think there is a lot of proof that says unconscious bias training doesn't work. That said, I believe it's better to have it if you're in early stages than not to have it, because we all have biases and we must be aware of our biases. And if it even is that one piece where you interview someone, they walk into the room and you previously would have thought, your brain says bias, but you recognize that bias and you recognize the fact that you've done that training where you're going to rethink and try and perhaps reposition questions in a way that you might have framed them quite differently.
Hopefully moving it from the unconscious to the conscious. So exactly. Yeah, I agree. It does seem intuitively like it's got to be
exactly
worthwhile.
But I see both channels of thought. I think unconscious bias training in exclusivity is not adequate, and with diversity and inclusion, belonging, it's like many things, like business for good, there is not one silver bullet that says, yeah, I've nailed it, business is perfect now forevermore. It's a living, breathing, sleeping thing that needs to be constantly evolved. Going back to your Darwinism comment before, about evolution, we are evolving as a species, our businesses are evolving, and we must always improve. But on the piece there that you mentioned about the applications, it's just an interesting one, because I think times like this are actually times where a huge amount of great innovations are coming out. And what I would say, again, happy to have a separate conversation about it if you wish, but when it comes to really kind of enticing in diverse talent in inverted commas, or talent that might come from places that we wouldn't have looked at previously, it is tapping into those communities and tapping into those individuals, whether it be, say I'm Chinese, tapping into, could it be Chinese communities? Actually, in reality, you scratch below the surface, I'm very much more British. As I think I've told you before, I was adopted by white British parents. We grew up in Yorkshire, even though we were born in Hong Kong. But the point being is that by connecting up and by having those individuals within our network from different faiths, different religions, LGBTQ+, mental health, etc., we then are able to unlock the pathways to those diverse pockets of talent. So again, happy to chat about it. And just sorry, one final piece, because this podcast absolutely is not about me talking, but about me listening to you. But it was just so interesting hearing the point that you made there about being, you've said it very modestly, a middle-aged white guy. Now, I mean, it's funny because I hear a lot of people say, oh, male, pale and stale. And I have to say, that sentence in and to itself, it often really pees me off, excuse my language, because I think actually there's so much to one's intersectionality. There's so many different things that are involved. We may, if we were to haven't gone up for our unconscious bias training or whatever, and we look at you without having scratched below the surface and find out what we found out. Well, actually, there is the background that says, look, you have ultimately, achieved through entrepreneurial mindset. The mindset is another thing that can be diverse. Having come from an international background, having seen the mix of cultures, moving across to the UK, there's so many different facets that make up you as an individual. For us to make the presumption that you are any middle-aged white male is factually incorrect. And Same for my husband, which I think I've mentioned to you before. He's, and I proudly say in my book, no offense to middle-aged white males, I married one. He is middle-aged, white, he's wonderful, but he's more Chinese than me. He lived in China for 12 years and he speaks fluent Mandarin, you know? So actually all these different eclectic things that make up diversity and inclusion are endless. And so the annotate, you know, you know, the sentence of kind of people speaking about, well, you know, what would a middle-aged white male know? Actually, often a huge amount. Anyhow, but Steve, you also mentioned there, you know, the importance of goal setting, which actually I think is completely, you know, it would be remiss of me not to ask you about goals and how organizations can support the wonderfully diverse 17 goals that the UN Global Compact stands for. Because I think you mentioned earlier in the conversation, without actually setting these goals, without looking at certain metrics, without analyzing, it's very hard for us to make a tangible difference and to be able to measure that into the sustainable future. Would you be able to share briefly a little about the UN SDGs? I'm sure everyone knows who the UN are and the SDGs, but for those that are thinking about getting involved or who are involved and want to be more involved, what can we learn about these goals that are really important for us as business leaders for the future?
Well, I think this is a really special moment in this. The strap line for the SDGs, when they were first sort of announced, was this is the future we want. And here we are with the present kind of in a bit of a, it's kind of stalled. And lots of talk about, you know, recovering better and just this whole recovery and going back to some kind of new normal. And I think it's absolutely vital that the new normal, the future that we're moving into, is the future we've already expressed very clearly through the SDGs, is the future we want. So I think it's really imperative on the government, as they are thinking about their recovery policies, that the SDGs are central to any policies that they're developing to bring about the world that we want. We've seen obviously some positives on the climate front with, you know, a huge drop in emissions, but coming at the expense obviously of jobs and probably this is not the way we want to reduce emissions. But nonetheless, can we build on aspects of this? More online meetings, less flying. There are things that we can take away from this experience that we can lock in and permanently reduce our climate impacts going forward. We have to reevaluate the definition of an essential worker. We have to really give a lot more thought to living wage and what does that mean. The people that are keeping us going right now, so many of them are working for less than a living wage. It's unconscionable that this is how we've allowed things to develop. So these are the kinds of changes that the global goals call for that I would like to see integrated into any policies as we work on a recovery. And it's not just the responsibility of government. I think every company needs to take a really hard look at, as they fire back up again and start resuming normal operations, that they're thinking about what have they learned about themselves as a company and how they fit into this agenda that's seeking to bring about the future we want. Just a quick plug then for a tool that was developed by UN Global Compact, WBCSD, and the GRI called the SDG Compass. And it's a really useful guide, sdgcompass.org, that just helps with a structure that a company can go through to help them understand how they interact with the goals and how they can make a positive contribution. And it just talks about, you know, mapping impacts against the targets of the goals, using the goals. You know, companies that want to set a target for how they're going to perform traditionally would, you know, look a little bit too much internally and think about what's possible and set a target from that. The goals provide an objective external reference point that really should be inspiring companies when they're thinking about setting a target for gender equality. Well, the global goal is we're going to be equal by 2030. So setting a target that's any less ambitious than that is really not sufficient. And so across the whole scope of the global goals, we need companies to look to that for their inspiration, set their targets for change to align with that agenda. And that's how we're going to really move things forward. We need that big step up in ambition. And then that needs to be integrated into companies. We need to align the incentives, not just the workers, but senior management need to have skin in the game to make that contribution really happen. And then the final piece in the compass is to talk about it and inspire others to get them to do the same.
That is so fantastic to hear, and I'm so excited. I mean, I'm excited every time I talk about the SDGs. Actually, very, very excited indeed. And I will make sure that all of the notes for that go into the show notes so people can go and check it out. And obviously, everyone who's listening, I'd massively encourage you to check out the SDGs and Compass that Steve's mentioned, because there's something there for everyone as well. That's the great thing about it is, these are not things that are so rigid in their bill that one can't relate to, one or many of the facets. And, and again, how excited I am about this white paper that we're going to be doing later this year. And we based that very much around the SDGs, and we pulled out those that we believe relate to D&I, and we'll be analysing the the FTSE organisations and those in government, civil service, public sector, etc., because it is absolutely key, and they provide such a great framework of reference for other great things to happen, and ultimately to utilise those, to holistically look at performance. And I love that it's called the compass, because ours is called the dial, and in the dial we have our 10 facets, which are all based around the UN SDGs, and then also the the protected characteristics again, which again, and I hope no one listens to this and tells me off. I think the protected characteristics are fantastic, but I also think the way to positively explain and engage others in a more holistic sense is by the SDGs and the fact that they represent so many different wonderful things. So, and Steve, before we run out of time today, I have a lightning round. There's some light-hearted fun, just to end off end this this fascinating podcast. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer each of the following questions, if that's okay with you.
Okay.
So first of all, what does diversity and inclusion mean to you personally?
Recognizing the value in different perspectives. So not being locked into one way of doing things, recognizing that there doesn't always have to be better or worse. You could just settle on different and recognize that there are different ways of doing things, and sometimes trying a different way may be the best thing to do.
Excellent. And I know that we can't be biased here, but I'm going to ask anyway. Have you got a favorite goal out of the SDGs?
Yeah, that's really tough. Depends on the context, which one I choose. I often choose...
Come on, I'll let you have two. You can have two, Steve.
Well, I often choose the life below water, the oceans goal, because it's the underdog, I suppose. When we so that's 14. When we do we ask companies which one is most important. That usually comes up near the bottom, but I think it's obviously vitally important. Usually we look to something that is the most interconnected, and they're all tremendously interconnected. But I usually settle on goal 5, which is the gender equality goal, or goal 13, the climate change goal. In both cases, success in that goal will have such an uplifting effect on so many other goals that it seems to me that if we were going to cherry pick and focus attention there, it would make a lot of sense to do that. I think this is true of many of them, but I think certainly on goal 5, it would impact on poverty and hunger and health and education and economic growth and justice, and really profoundly impactful across the whole agenda. And so I think that it really makes a lot of sense to focus there.
Very good rationale behind that reasoning. My favorite goal, so you know, is number 10, reduced inequalities. I love that one. But again, they're all fantastic. Another one that I added in, actually, you mentioned before, you know, various modes of transport when it comes to, you know, rollerblading. When you talked about it before, I thought, oh God, I used to absolutely love rollerblading. Have you a favorite mode of transport? Obviously, an eco-friendly one.
Yeah, well, I have to say bicycle. When I took my extended break, I did a couple of very long bike rides. So I rode around Europe for almost a year, and then I later rode from Vancouver down to Mexico. I love riding the bike. Now, to be honest, I suppose even better is cross-country skiing, but it's hard to get to work that way. So no, definitely, I think, again, key to our successful future is more bikes. I look at the, you know, when I was growing up, we used to see photographs of China. You know, it'd be a photo of a bicycle traffic jam in Beijing, and it was almost looked at as, you know, how backwards. But this is absolutely the future we need to return to. And I wonder, even the people of Beijing and putting up with the horrible air quality that they have to endure, how many of them would actually welcome a return to a more bicycle-centric transportation system. So, yeah.
Indeed. I have to say I'm a fan of that. Well, I love the bike, actually, but I love rollerblades. You don't see that many people rollerblading, do you?
No.
It's just not enough of them. I don't know why that is. Why
Well,
is
we're
that?
about to pull ours out again because they've resurfaced a bunch of the streets around our house, and with traffic so low right now, it's a perfect time to get out there and enjoy. So
Ah, that's
we're
so
definitely going to
cool.
do some of that.
Do you know, I regret so much having thrown away my old rollerblades. I think I threw them out shortly after I broke my arm going down a quarter
Well,
pipe, which is a massive accident. But yeah, I used to have those, you know, the Bauer ones. Do you remember? Oh
yeah,
God,
yeah,
they
yeah.
were just brilliant. There's nothing like going on a good
Oh,
rollerblade.
yeah. It's really
Oh,
fun.
brilliant,
Yes.
brilliant.
Yeah.
Anyhow, I could sit here and talk to you all day, Steve. That's the problem. So
Yes.
final question for you then. If you could go back and give the young Steve back in Canada some advice before he started up his business and before he went on the epic tale of adventure across to the UK and working for one of the most well-known organizations in the world, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Probably to be more bold. I think there is a great quote about it. I don't even remember who it's from, but something along the lines of that there's a, you know, there's a magic in it. And I found the times when I have taken a big gamble, it's paid off handsomely. And even when it hasn't worked out, um, fewer occasions where it hasn't worked out, it's been a really useful learning experience. So I think that's it. I've probably been too deferential and too cautious. So yes, for younger self, that would be the advice.
Very good. So it's like the famous quote then, he, or I should say he or she who dares wins.
Yes,
It's one of
exactly.
my favorite quotes. Well, thank you ever
Yeah.
so much, Steve, for being here. I always do my summary at the end, but I will keep it short, I promise. There's been so many wonderful learning pieces from today, and it's been fascinating as well, learning about your background. And I hope, and I am sure that this podcast will inspire many to go on and do good in their personal life, but also within their businesses, because you're never too small to ultimately make a difference. And if not now, as Steve has said, then ultimately when. This is a fantastic time for change and innovation, and to really start as organisations pinning colours to masts and really looking at how we can do things slightly differently, and also engage our workforces and engage you know, those who we want to draw in talent-wise for the future. And you know, genuinely, I know we've plugged it a couple of times, but it deserves it completely, is check out the UN Global Compact and the Sustainable Development Goals. The other key point actually that I would mention, certainly in terms of learnings, I think it was really, really interesting learning about the unconscious bias piece, and also how, you know, using your words, Steve, not mine, how a middle-aged white guy actually can make a huge difference, and to really positively influence those around them and also wider society. So thank you ever so much, Steve, for being here. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, Leila. Pleasure for me also.
Thanks so much. My name is Leila Mackenzie-Dellis, and you've been listening to the Dial Global podcast, Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, with the wonderful Steve Kenzie today. If you've missed anything, don't worry at all. We're going to put all the key learning points along with all the links that Steve has mentioned, so you can check out and read up further on the goals and on the compass as well for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Visit us at www.dialglobal.org/podcast, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.